The chamber no longer had a name. Not officially. Not anymore. Long ago, 3,000 years by the Accord's oldest records, it had been known as the Hall of Convergence, a place so carefully constructed that even silence inside it felt regulated. It was the only chamber in the known galaxy where the 47 sovereign species of the Galactic Accord could gather without translation errors, territorial posturing, or accidental declarations of war. At least, that was the legend. The structure itself had been forged from the remnants of a dead star, its architecture stabilized by gravitational locks, older than most civilizations still in existence. It did not orbit a world. It anchored one. Suspended in space, it was illuminated by the frozen light of 7 distant suns, captured, contained, and repurposed as eternal illumination. Every surface of the chamber carried history. Not written history, recorded history. Names of wars that had been ended here, names of pandemics that had been contained here, names of civilizations that had been admitted here after proving, in one form or another, that they would not immediately destabilize everything around them. Over time, those inscriptions had stopped feeling like achievements and started feeling like warnings. Because the longer the Accord endured, the more the Hall of Convergence began to resemble something else entirely. Not a place of unity, but a place where the galaxy documented what it had survived. Now it was simply called the room where everything changed, and it had not even happened yet. Arbiter Prime Thesane of the Vorkai pressed 12 of her fingers flat against the obsidian council table, steadying herself. The Vorkai were not known for trembling. They were among the oldest species in the Accord, patient, cold-blooded in every sense, having survived 4 ice ages and 2 extinction events through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. Thesane herself was 900 years old and had voted on decisions that reshaped the trajectories of civilizations. She was trembling now. The transmission had arrived 17 hours ago, routed through the Accord's deepest relay network, a network that had never once been accessed without authorization in 11 centuries of operation, and yet somehow, impossibly, something had used it. Something had bypassed every firewall, every authentication layer, every quantum-encrypted handshake developed by the finest minds of 14 species, and left a message. 11 words, nothing more. We have been patient. Patience has limits. We are ready. The message was unsigned. It did not need to be. Everyone in that chamber, everyone with clearance above level 7, already knew who had sent it. The humans. 44 years ago, humanity had applied for admission to the Galactic Accord. The application had been received, catalogued, and quietly shelved. Humans were, by the metrics the Accord used to classify civilizations, barely Category 3, a young species barely 1,000 years past their first crewed spaceflight, still occasionally at war with themselves, still divided into hundreds of competing political entities. The Accord's admission threshold required Category 6 at minimum, a species that had achieved unified governance, abandoned planet-based resource conflicts, and demonstrated at least 3 centuries of cooperative interstellar activity. Humanity had none of these things. So the Accord had done what it always did, with premature applications. Acknowledged receipt, assigned a monitoring delegation, and moved on. The monitoring delegation had filed reports every year for 4 decades. Most of them were unremarkable. Humans built things. Humans argued with each other. Humans had a disturbing tendency to solve problems through methods that, frankly, made the xenobiologists uncomfortable. But nothing in those reports had triggered any of the 47 standard alarm thresholds until 8 months ago, when the monitoring delegation had simply stopped responding. The last report had been 6 pages long. The first 5 pages were routine. The 6th page, the final page, was a single sentence written in high Accord script, the formal language of official communication, in a hand that signature analysis confirmed belonged to Senior Monitor. A thesisolian with 30 years of field experience and a record of unimpeachable professionalism. The sentence read, "I think we made a terrible mistake." Then, nothing. Silence for 8 months. Attempts to contact the delegation, 112. Responses received, 0. Attempts to send a retrieval team, 3 retrievals completed, 0. The first team ship had returned empty with no crew, its navigation logs erased, and its hull scored by something the metallurgists still could not identify. The second team had sent a single burst transmission, static, and one human word, which the translator had rendered as magnificent, before going dark. The third team had not even made it out of the relay corridor. So here they sat, 47 species, staring at 11 words on a screen, and Arbiter Prime the Sane was trembling, and the Hall of Convergence had no name anymore. And outside the station's viewports, the stars burned cold and indifferent. And somewhere out in the dark, beyond the edge of mapped space, humanity was ready. The question that no one wanted to ask, but that every single being in that chamber was thinking, was this ready for what? The lights went out, not gradually, not with a flicker or a warning. All at once, every light source in the Hall of Convergence, the artificial suns in their ceiling mounts, the bioluminescent strips along the walls, the glow panels embedded in the council table, the emergency backup phosphor that were supposed to be physically impossible to disable. All of it extinguished simultaneously. For exactly 3 seconds, the oldest room in the known galaxy was completely dark. Then a single screen on the far wall lit up. It showed a ship. There was silence in that chamber for a very long time. Then High Counselor Emvith of the Dreth, a species not known for understatement, who had described the Accord's greatest ever military engagement as somewhat concerning, leaned forward in the dark and said very quietly, "What in every name of every god of every species in this room is that the ship on the screen had no frame of reference." That was the first problem. In deep space imaging, ships were always shown relative to something. A moon, a station, another vessel, a debris field. You needed context to understand scale. The Accord sensor buoys, which ringed the entire mapped galaxy in a web of 40 billion monitoring points, had been designed by species who understood this fundamental principle of visual comprehension. Whoever had sent this transmission had understood it too. They had placed the ship next to a planet. The planet was not small. Thesson recognized it instantly. Vera 4, the gas giant that anchored the Verith system, a world 11 times the mass of the Accord's standard gravitational reference unit. A planet so large that 3 of the Accord's most developed colony worlds could fit inside it with room to spare. Very before was used in Accord navigation charts as a waypoint, specifically because it was visually unmistakable. Every navigator in the galaxy knew it. The ship was larger, not by a small margin, not by some technical quibble about measurement methodology or sensor calibration. The ship was simply unambiguously, undeniably larger than Verith 4, longer by a factor the sensor overlay calculated at approximately 1.3, wider across its midsection by a factor the system tried to render before apparently deciding that the number was implausible and flagging it for review. Thesson heard from somewhere to her left the sound of a Kulthani, a species whose emotional responses to overwhelming information manifested as involuntary photosynthesis beginning to glow. She understood the feeling. The ship was not beautiful. She wanted to note that to remind herself of it, because there was something about its sheer presence that the mind wanted to aestheticize to make into something noble. It was not noble. It was brutal. It looked like something that had been designed by beings who had looked at the concept of a ship, understood its purpose completely, and then asked what would happen if they took that purpose to its absolute logical extreme, and then kept going. It was dark. Not the reflective dark of polished metal or the absorptive dark of stealth coating, but a deep structural darkness, as if the hull itself was consuming light rather than simply failing to reflect it. Along its length, at irregular intervals, there were features that the Accord's classification systems were cycling through 17 different categories, trying to identify weapon mounts, engine arrays, communication arrays, hull reinforcement structures. The AI kept reassigning them, cycling through possibilities because nothing in its database matched. At the bow, if it had a bow, the ship was roughly symmetrical along 2 axes, but not 3. There was a single point of light. It was white, and it was very bright, and it pulsed with a rhythm that the Accord's xenocommunication specialists were already frantically analyzing, looking for patterns. They found one immediately. It was a heartbeat. "How long?" Thean asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. The chief technical analyst, a young Medi named Solus, who had held the position for 3 years, and who Thess had previously considered one of the most composed individuals she had ever met, looked up from his console with the expression of someone who had just been asked to explain color to a species without eyes. "How long? What? Arbiter Prime, how long have they been building that? Solus looked back at his console. He ran 3 separate queries. He checked the output twice. He appeared to briefly consider whether the appropriate professional response was to simply lie based on the materials analysis, assuming standard human manufacturing techniques, which may not apply minimum 6 years, more likely based on the structural complexity. He paused. 12, possibly 15. Silence. They've been building this, Desane said slowly. For the entire time we've been monitoring them. For the entire time we've been monitoring them, Solus confirmed, and possibly longer. We have no records of construction beginning, which means either our monitoring was insufficient, or they didn't want us to see it. Yes, Orbiter Prime. The implications cascaded through the chamber like a stone dropped in still water. If the humans had hidden the construction of a ship this size from Accord monitoring for 15 years, then everything the Accord thought it knew about humanity's capabilities was wrong. If they were wrong about the capabilities, they were wrong about the timeline. If they were wrong about the timeline, they were wrong about the threat assessment. If they were wrong about the threat assessment, of the Dreth stood up. I move, he said in the formal voice he used for official motions, that we immediately invoke Article 17 of the Accord Charter and begin emergency defensive mobilization. Article 17 said the Ain has never been invoked. Correct. It requires unanimous consent. I'm aware. It authorizes the Accord to treat the triggering species as an existential threat and respond accordingly. I know what it says, said Emmett, and his voice broke on the last word, in a way that Thasan had never heard from him before. And that was when she understood how frightened he was. And when she understood how frightened he was, she understood how frightened she should be. What I am saying, Arbiter Prime, is that we are looking at a ship larger than a gas giant, built in secret by a species we classified as Category 3, that has been sitting on our doorstep for God knows how long, waiting for us to notice. And I would like very much to do something about it, before it decides to do something about us. The screen changed. The image of the ship disappeared, replaced by a face. Human, female, perhaps 40 years old by human reckoning, with close-cropped gray hair and dark eyes, and the kind of stillness that Thasan associated with very dangerous things, that had learned the value of patience. She was wearing a uniform, not the chaotic patchwork of different national militaries that the Accord's files showed humans typically wore, but a single unified design, dark with gold accents. And on the chest, where humans typically place their insignia, there was a symbol that Thasan had never seen before. Not any nation's flag, not any corporation's logo, not any faction's mark. Something new. The woman looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then she said, in perfect high Accord script, without translation, without a device, in a language that had never been taught to any human the Accord had ever encountered. My name is Admiral Yara Owe. I represent the Unified Terran Directorate. We have a proposal for the Council. A pause. We are prepared to be reasonable. We hope you are as well. Another pause. You have 6 hours to respond. The screen went dark. Thien counted 47 species in that room, representing 600 billion sentient beings across 312 inhabited worlds. Not one of them spoke for a very long time. The emergency session lasted 4 hours, which left 2 hours of the Admiral's deadline. In those 4 hours, the Galactic Accords did what it had always done in moments of existential uncertainty. It argued. The Athrani delegation argued that the ship was a bluff, that no species at humanity's demonstrated level of development could have produced something of that scale, and that therefore the image was fabricated, a psychological pressure tactic designed to force concessions without actual capability to back them up. The Athrani had a long history of exactly this sort of tactic themselves, which perhaps explained why they recognized it so readily. The Kolthani delegation, now actively photosynthesizing at a rate that was causing minor interference with nearby electronics, argued that it did not matter whether it was a bluff, because the ability to send a transmission like this through their security network in their language was itself sufficient evidence of capability to constitute a Category 6 threat response trigger. Regardless of what the ship could or could not do, the Dreth led by Emberth argued for Article 17 loudly and repeatedly. The Mavari argued for immediate diplomatic contact and the formation of a new working committee. 3 delegations argued simultaneously in 3 different directions for approximately 40 minutes, before the silenced them all by doing something she had done exactly twice in 900 years of life. She shouted, Enough. Silence. We will not vote on Article 17 tonight. We will not. Because Article 17 requires unanimous consent, and I will personally vote against it, which means it cannot pass. And I am telling you this now, so that we do not waste another hour on a motion that is going to fail. Are we clear? M opened his mouth. Are we clear? He closed it. Good. Now I want information. Solus. And what do we actually know about the Unified Terran Directorate? Chief Technical Analyst Solus had spent the 4 hours of argument doing what analysts do, analyzing. He had pulled every file in the Accords database on humanity, cross-referenced it with the monitoring delegation's reports, flagged everything that had been tagged as anomalous or low priority, and assembled it all into a picture that he was not entirely comfortable presenting, but that he presented anyway because that was his job. The Unified Terran Directorate, Solus said, pulling up a holographic display that showed a political map of humanity's solar system in nearby space, does not appear in our records prior to approximately 11 years ago. Before that point, our monitoring data shows the standard human political fragmentation, hundreds of nation-states, dozens of interplanetary entities, several competing off-world colonial administrations. Then approximately 11 years ago, the pattern changes. The holographic map shifted, simplified, compressed. Hundreds of political borders collapsed into one. Over a period of approximately 18 months, every human government, on every human-inhabited world, signed what their public records call the Terran Consolidation Accord. We flagged this at the time as a significant political development, but classified it as internal reorganization. Human governments consolidate and fragment regularly, and the monitoring delegation assessed that this consolidation would likely be temporary. A pause. That assessment was apparently incorrect. The Directorate has been in continuous unified governance for 11 years. Thesivane said, 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days. Solus confirmed. Without a single significant internal conflict, without a single secession attempt, without, he stopped, looked at his display, without, as far as we can determine, a single publicly recorded political assassination. The silence this time had a different quality. That's Empre said, for a species at their developmental stage. Solus said, yes, by our models, the probability of a species in humanity's historical conflict profile achieving this level of political unity without either significant authoritarian consolidation or external existential threat was approximately 0.03%. Which one is it? Thesan asked. We don't know. Their internal communications are encrypted beyond our current decryption capability. What we do know is that their resource allocation changed dramatically in the year following the Consolidation 40, and their public science output, Solus continued, which we track through academic publication networks, shows an extraordinary acceleration in the same period, particularly in the fields of material science, propulsion theory, and he hesitated, and what they call existential risk management, which is as near as our analysts can determine, a human academic field devoted to the study of how civilizations get destroyed. The room was very quiet. Thene leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the Hall of Convergence, the ceiling that had been carved from the bones of a dead star that had watched 3,000 years of galactic history play out beneath it. She thought about what she knew of humanity. She thought about what the monitoring reports had described. A species born into scarcity, forged by violence, shaped by millennia of conflict with each other and their environment, and the fundamental hostility of their world. A species that had clawed its way out of a gravity well on chemical explosions and sheer refusal to stay down. A species that had looked at a universe that did not care whether they lived or died, and had decided apparently that this was unacceptable. She thought about the moment. She knew the moment precisely because it was in the monitoring files when humanity had first detected Accord communication signals 14 years ago. The reaction in human public discourse had been immediate and overwhelming, and by Accord xenopsychological standards completely abnormal. The expected response to first confirmation of alien intelligence was some combination of awe, fear, existential crisis, and diplomatic overture. Humanity had done all of those things, and then apparently they had kept going, because 14 years ago was 3 years before the consolidation, which meant the consolidation had come after the discovery, which meant Solus. Thesan said, what was the stated rationale for the Terran Consolidation Accord? A pause while he searched. The public documentation is extensive, but largely symbolic. The core text cites, and I'm translating here, the recognition that humanity's future is singular, that our survival in a populated universe depends upon our capacity to speak with one voice, and that the time for internal division has passed. They unified, Tessin said very slowly, because they found us. That appears to be the most accurate interpretation. Yes. And then they spent 11 years building. Building a ship, M said, and his voice was strange now, stripped of its earlier anger, replaced by something that sounded almost like awe, larger than a gas giant, because they did not want to come to us as supplements. Silence. They rejected, Tessin said, and the thought was still forming as she spoke it. Our categories, we classified them as Category 3, and they classified themselves as what? What category are they? No one answered. Because there was no category for what humanity had apparently become. The doors to the Hall of Convergence opened. A single figure walked in, not a hologram, not a transmission, a physical person. Human, male, tall, wearing the same dark and gold uniform as the Admiral on the screen, with the same unfamiliar symbol on his chest. He was perhaps 60 years old, with the kind of face that had spent decades doing something very hard, and had been shaped by it. He walked to the center of the chamber and stopped. He looked around the room at 47 species representing 600 billion beings. He said, "I am Ambassador Kiran Ma of the Unified Terran Directorate. The Admiral sends her regards and apologizes for the dramatic entrance. We considered a less theatrical approach, but our advisors felt that the Council might benefit from a demonstration that our transit capability is what we've indicated." "You teleported onto a secured station," M said. "Yes, that's impossible. It's inconvenient," the ambassador said pleasantly, "but not impossible. We've been working on it for about 7 years." Thean looked at him for a long moment. "Ambassador," she said, "your admiral mentioned a proposal." "She did. I would like to hear it." "Of course." He reached into his jacket and produced a single data chip, physical, not transmitted physical, which was itself a statement, and placed it on the council table. "Everything is in there, but I can summarize if you prefer." "Please, we want in," Ambassador Mehta said simply. "We want membership in the Galactic Accord. Full membership, not associate status, not monitored provisional membership, not the Category 3 holding pattern you've had us in for 40 years. Full membership with all rights and responsibilities thereof. Your application was reviewed," Thean said carefully. "We determined that humanity did not meet the threshold, for we know what you determined," the ambassador said. Not rudely, simply, "We've had 40 years to read the assessment. We disagree with the threshold. We think your categories are designed for a pattern of development that assumes a species progresses slowly, that you have time to monitor and assess and decide, that the thing you're looking at is going to stay more or less the same between the time you first see it and the time you vote on it." A pause. "We are not that thing, and if we refuse?" Thean asked. The ambassador's expression did not change. "Then we will not be members of the Galactic Accord," he said. "And we will continue to exist in the galaxy, in the same galaxy as you, doing what we do, building what we build, going where we decide to go." Another pause. "We are not making a threat, Arbiter Prime. We are making an observation. We think you should be part of our future. We think you might find it interesting. We are asking politely for the last time whether you would like to join us or whether you would prefer to watch." The vote should have taken days. By accord procedure, a full membership application required a minimum of 72 hours of open debate, a formal review period, a written assessment from the Xenosciological Committee, a security evaluation, and 3 separate readings of the formal resolution before any vote could be called. That was for normal applications. There had never been an abnormal one. Ambassador Ma sat quietly in a chair at the edge of the chamber, while 47 species held the most chaotic deliberation in Accord history. He had declined refreshments and declined company, and spent most of the time reading something on a small device he had produced from his jacket. When Thesson's aide quietly tried to see what he was reading, the ambassador had smiled and tilted the screen. It was poetry, human poetry, old by human standards, a collection of works from a period they called the 20th century. He did not seem anxious. That Desson thought was perhaps the most frightening thing about him. The arguments had a different character now than they had before he arrived. Before the debate had been about threat. What does this mean for our security? How do we protect ourselves? What are they capable of now? Impossible to ignore the physical presence of a human being who had appeared in the middle of their secured station without triggering a single alarm. Who had placed a physical data chip on their table, with the casual confidence of someone who was accustomed to being in rooms and being listened to, who was currently reading poetry. The debate shifted because the threat calculus had changed. The question was no longer whether humanity was dangerous. The question was whether humanity was more dangerous inside the Accord or outside it. Emeth of the Dreth, who had spent 4 hours demanding Article 17, said something that surprised everyone, including himself. We built this Accord to prevent exactly this situation. A powerful species operating outside the framework of galactic governance, with no treaty obligations, no accountability structures, no agreed-upon rules of conduct. We built it because species like that are how you get wars that end civilizations. He paused. The question is not whether we want humanity in the Accord. The question is whether we want to be the kind of civilization that looks at something we don't understand and tries to destroy it, or the kind that tries to understand it first. A very long silence. That is, said the representative of the Ythrani slowly, and somewhat painfully not incorrect. The data chip contained a full briefing. The Accord's analysts had cracked the encryption within 20 minutes, which was itself a message Thean suspected, because the chip was human technology. And if they could crack human encryption in 20 minutes, it meant either that they were much better than humans at cryptography, or that the humans had let them crack it. She suspected the latter. The briefing inside was comprehensive, clearly structured, and designed. She could tell this from its presentation to be read by beings who were deciding whether to be afraid of humanity or to work with them. It included specifications for the ship. Its actual name, she learned, was the persistent question, a human phrase that apparently meant something both philosophical and practical. A question that keeps being asked until it is answered. The persistent question was not a warship, though it was armed. It was the briefing used a human term that the translator rendered awkwardly, a demonstration vessel, a proof of concept, the thing humanity had built to show the galaxy what humanity could do. There were 17 more under construction, of similar size, with improvements. The briefing also included something unexpected, an honest account of humanity's history, not a curated version, not a best-foot-forward diplomatic presentation, a complete account, including the wars, the genocides, the environmental devastation, the centuries of cruelty and short-sightedness and failure. Beside each dark passage, there was a note, not an excuse, not an apology, but a specific reference description of what humanity had done to address, understand, or prevent that category of failure in the future. It was not a document that said, "We are good." It was a document that said, "We know what we are, and we are working on it, and we would like to keep working on it alongside you if you'll have us." Thesson read that document for 2 hours, then she called the vote. The procedure under emergency session rules was simple. Each delegation cast a vote, yea or nay, in the order of their Accord seniority. 47 votes, 24 needed for a simple majority, 32 for a supermajority that would grant full rather than provisional membership. The first 12 votes were yea. The 13th vote from a delegation that had spent the entire session in visible distress was a nay. The 14th was yea. By the time the vote reached Thesson, who as Arbiter Prime voted last, the count was 43 Y and 3 nay. She looked at Ambassador Ma, who had put away his poetry at the calling of the vote, and was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, watching. She looked at the data chip still sitting on the table. She looked at the ceiling, the ancient ceiling of carved starbone, and thought about 3,000 years of history, about the wars this room had ended, and the plagues it had halted, and the species it had welcomed, about the 47 civilizations that had looked at a universe that could easily have swallowed them whole, and decided to face it together instead. She thought about a species that had unified in response to finding them, that had built a ship to show them what they were capable of, that had sent a single ambassador into their most secured chamber to ask one more time to be treated as equals. She thought about Senior Monitor's last report. I think we made a terrible mistake. Not a warning, she thought. A recognition. Yea, she said. The Galactic Accord did not dissolve that day, but it was never the same. The 3 delegations that had voted nay submitted formal protests, and then over the following weeks, quietly withdrew them. Because the thing about being in a room with Ambassador Mane, later told her staff, was that you left the room having understood something you had not understood when you entered it. Humanity had not come to conquer. Humanity had not come to demand. Humanity had come to negotiate from a position of strength. It had spent a decade building in secret, and it had brought poetry. That meant something. She was not sure what exactly, but it meant something. 3 days after the vote, Admiral Yara Away brought the persistent question to dock at the Hall of Convergence Station. It did not fit in the docking bay, obviously, so it simply held position outside, visible through every viewport on the station, enormous and dark and pulsing with its slow heartbeat light, while its crew, 3,000 humans, came aboard in shuttle after shuttle for what the Accord's protocol department was hastily labeling a historic first contact formalization ceremony. The humans brought food, they brought music, they brought apparently an inexhaustible capacity for ceremony and celebration that the Accord's xenopsychologists had not anticipated and that turned out to be deeply unexpectedly moving. They also brought, at Admiral Owai's personal insistence, the complete archives of Earth's history. Every war, every art movement, every scientific breakthrough, every failure and recovery, encoded on a crystal that she placed in the hands with the directness Thean was learning, was simply how humans communicated when they meant something seriously. So you understand us, Osei said. We don't need you to approve of everything in there. We just need you to know. Thean held the crystal and felt the weight of it. The weight of a species' entire recorded memory, offered without reservation, and thought about the 44 years since humanity's first application, and the 40 years since it had been shelved, and the 11 years of unity and construction, and quiet preparation, and the 6 hours of an ultimatum that was not quite an ultimatum, and the vote that had taken 2 hours instead of 72. We know, she said. Outside the viewports, the persistent question held steady in the dark between stars, patient now that patience had reached its limit, vast and new, and waiting to see what came next. Inside the Hall of Convergence, 47 species and 1 new member were beginning to understand what it meant to share a galaxy with something that did not know how to stay in the categories you built for it. It was, Thean thought, going to be extraordinary. It was going to be terrifying. It was going to be exactly what 3,000 years of galactic cooperation had been working toward without knowing it. She was 900 years old. She had never been so glad that she had more